Cemetery director watches Daniel Thompson visit his dead wife's grave every Sunday for 8 months. He brings coffee, talks for hours, but his ritual turns darker. When Daniel arrives with a suitcase full of memories during a thunderstorm, something happens that defies all explanation. And the woman who appears at his funeral looks exactly like his deceased wife. When you work at a cemetery, you see things that make you question everything you thought you knew about life and death. What happened to the Thompson couple was one of those things. Hit that subscribe button and leave a like if you're ready to hear something that will really mess with your head. I want you to listen to this story, then tell me in the comments. Would you do what Daniel did for someone you love? My name is Robert Mitchell. I've been running Greenwood Memorial Cemetery for 12 years. In this job, you learn to read grief. You know when it's healthy, and you know when it's the kind that kills you slowly. I should have trusted my gut about Daniel Thompson. Daniel showed up every Sunday at 2:30 sharp. Blue Honda Civic, same parking spot by the oak tree in Section C. He never missed a week in the 8 months after we buried his wife, Maria. Rain, snow, blazing heat. Didn't matter, he'd be there. Maria died at 34 in a car accident on Route 9. The funeral broke my heart, and I've seen hundreds. Daniel just stood there like someone had ripped his soul right out. He stared at that casket like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Poor guy was only 36 himself. What made Daniel different was his ritual. Every Sunday, he'd bring 2 coffee cups from Murphy's Diner downtown. He'd walk to Maria's grave in Section D, sit on the stone bench, place 1 cup on her headstone, keep the other. Then he'd talk to her for exactly 2 hours, like she was sitting right there listening. I first noticed this about 3 weeks after the funeral. I was doing my usual rounds when I saw him there with those 2 coffee cups. At first, I figured he was waiting for family, but week after week, it was just Daniel, talking quietly to granite, treating that headstone like his wife was on the other side, sipping coffee and hearing about his week. I never interrupted him. Grief is personal. The last thing someone needs is the cemetery director butting in with empty words. But I watched him, partly from professional concern, partly from curiosity. Over those months, I saw his ritual change in ways that should have been warning signs. Spring started with tears, not dramatic movie crying, but the quiet, steady kind that comes with shock. Daniel would talk in broken sentences, voice catching, hands shaking as he held his coffee. Sometimes he'd reach out and trace Maria's name on the granite with his fingertips, like he could feel her through the stone. By summer, the tears stopped, but the talking continued. His voice got steadier, more like normal conversation. He'd tell Maria about work, about clients who drove him crazy, about the new restaurant on Main Street, about the neighbor's cat sleeping on their porch. Real married couple talk, sharing the little stuff that makes up a life. That's when I noticed he'd lost weight, maybe 15 pounds. His clothes hung loose, face looked drawn. Late summer changed everything. Daniel still came every Sunday, still brought 2 coffees, still sat for 2 hours, but the talking dropped to whispers. Mostly he just sat in silence, holding his cup with both hands, staring at that headstone with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Sometimes I'd see him reach toward the empty space on the bench, his hand moving like he was holding invisible fingers. That's when I started worrying. After 12 years here, I know the difference between healthy grief and the kind that pulls you so deep into the past you can't see any future. Daniel was showing all the wrong signs. I thought about approaching him, maybe suggesting he talk to Pastor Williams or Dr. Chen, the grief counselor. But every time I worked up the courage, something held me back. Maybe respect for his privacy. Maybe my own discomfort with other people's pain. Either way, I kept my distance, told myself that as long as he wasn't causing problems, it wasn't my business. Autumn brought something new that really got to me. Daniel started bringing things from home, stuff that obviously belonged to Maria. One Sunday, it was a paperback romance novel he placed beside her coffee cup. Another time, a small potted violet he positioned at the base of her marker. Once I saw him bring a jewelry box that he opened and left on the granite for his whole visit, then took it home. But it was the suitcase that should have been my final warning. That last Sunday in March was one of those confused early spring days. Couldn't decide what weather it wanted. Started bright and clear. But by noon, heavy clouds rolled in from the west. The air felt charged, like the sky was holding its breath. I heard Daniel's Honda pull in around 2:15. But something was different. Instead of the usual quick door slam and footsteps on gravel, there was a long pause. I looked out my window, saw him standing by his car, staring up at the darkening sky with an expression I couldn't read. Then I saw the suitcase, navy blue with brass corners, the vintage kind that speaks of better times and happy trips. Daniel lifted it from his trunk with both hands, handling it like something sacred. Even from my window, I could tell this wasn't just any luggage. There was something deliberate about how he carried it, like it meant everything. After 12 years managing this place, you develop instincts for when something's wrong. It's not anything specific, more like the normal rhythm getting disrupted. Watching Daniel walk to Section D with that suitcase and his usual coffee cups, every professional instinct I had was screaming that this Sunday was different. I tried focusing on paperwork, but kept glancing out the window. Daniel had reached Maria's grave, going through his routine. One coffee on the headstone, one for himself, settling on the bench, but that suitcase sat beside him like a third person, and instead of his usual talking posture, he sat perfectly still, hands folded, staring at the headstone with scary intensity. By 3:30, the clouds had thickened. Fat raindrops started falling. Most people would have headed for cover, but Daniel stayed put, like he didn't even notice the weather. I grabbed an umbrella, decided to walk over, officially to check drainage around the older graves, really to get a closer look at what was happening. As I got near Maria's grave, I could hear Daniel talking, but his voice was different. Not the conversational tone I'd heard for months. This was urgent, intense, words tumbling out like he was running out of time. I couldn't make out specifics from where I hid behind a monument 20 feet away. But the emotional weight was unmistakable. Rain was falling steady now, but Daniel seemed completely unaware. His clothes soaked, hair plastered to his head, but he kept talking to that headstone with desperation that bordered on panic. At one point, he put his hand on the suitcase. I heard him say something like, "I brought everything you loved, Maria, everything we shared." I should have approached him then, should have offered shelter, tried to talk, but something held me back. Maybe the sacred nature of what I was seeing, maybe my own cowardice facing that much raw grief. Instead, I went back to my office. Watched from the window as Daniel continued his vigil in the rain. By 5 o'clock, well past his usual time, he was still there. Rain had turned into a downpour. I was genuinely worried. I decided to go insist he come inside, but then I saw him stand up. Instead of heading to his car, he did something that made my blood run cold. Daniel opened the suitcase. From my window, I couldn't see exactly what was inside, but I watched him remove items, placed them carefully around Maria's grave. Took him nearly 20 minutes, handling each thing like religious artifacts. When he finished, he closed the empty suitcase, set it aside, returned to the bench. But now he wasn't talking, just sitting in the pouring rain, perfectly still, staring at Maria's headstone, surrounded by whatever memories he'd brought from home. Something final about his posture, like a man who'd said everything he needed to say and was just waiting. I stayed in my office until after dark, checking every few minutes. Rain stopped around 7:30, but he remained on that bench, motionless as stone. By 9 o'clock, I was about to call police when I saw Daniel finally stand. He gathered the items from around the grave, returned them to the suitcase, walked slowly to his car. I watched his headlights disappear, told myself everything was fine, that he just needed a longer visit. But deep down, where professional instincts live, I knew I'd just witnessed something that felt like goodbye. I should have called him that night. Should have found his number and checked on him, but I didn't. Went home to my family, had dinner, helped my daughter with homework, tried convincing myself I was overreacting. Monday morning came gray and drizzly. I got to the cemetery at 7:30, same as always, started my usual routine. We had a 10 o'clock service for Mrs. Patterson, a 93-year-old who'd passed peacefully in her sleep. Tommy Rodriguez, our groundskeeper, found Daniel. Tommy's worked here almost as long as I've been director. Quiet, reliable guy who takes pride in the grounds. Has supernatural ability to spot anything out of place. That Monday morning, he was doing his usual Section D inspection when he came running to my office. Face pale, hands shaking. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, barely catching his breath. "You need to come to Section D right now. There's someone by the Thompson grave, and I think he's dead." The walk felt like forever, even though it was maybe 2 minutes. Tommy led the way, his usual steady pace replaced by urgent, almost frantic strides. As we got close to Section D, I could see a figure slumped on the stone bench beside Maria's headstone. My heart sank, recognizing Daniel's profile. He was sitting exactly like I'd last seen him, but now his stillness had a quality that was unmistakably final. Head tilted back slightly, eyes closed, hands folded peacefully. If not for the unnatural pallor and complete absence of breathing, he might have just looked like someone taking a nap. But Daniel Thompson wasn't napping. Daniel Thompson was dead. When you find a body on cemetery grounds, there are protocols. Secure the area, call 911, don't touch anything. I'd been through this twice before. Once when an elderly man had a heart attack visiting his wife. Once when a teenager overdosed behind the maintenance shed. Both times the protocol served me well. But standing there looking at Daniel's lifeless form, I struggled to maintain professional detachment. This wasn't just any body. This was someone I'd watched and worried about for months. Someone whose grief I'd witnessed evolve from raw anguish to quiet desperation. I sent Tommy to call 911 while I stayed to secure the scene. Waiting for police and paramedics, I noticed details that would haunt me for weeks. A small white envelope tucked under Daniel's right hand, "To whom it may concern," written in careful block letters. On the ground beside the bench, an empty prescription bottle with Daniel's name clearly visible, and scattered around Maria's grave, exactly as I'd seen him arrange them, were items telling the story of a marriage cut short. Wedding photo of Daniel and Maria laughing at something outside the camera's view. Small jewelry box with Maria's rings. Paperback Pride and Prejudice stuffed with bookmarks made from ticket stubs and receipts. CD of their wedding song, small potted orchid with a note saying it was Maria's favorite flower. And most heartbreaking, 2 delicate china coffee cups with floral patterns, the special occasion kind. Not the thermal cups from Murphy's Diner. Police arrived within 10 minutes, followed by paramedics and the county coroner. Detective Sarah Walsh took charge with professional efficiency, photographing everything, bagging evidence, interviewing Tommy and me about finding the body and Daniel's recent behavior. The envelope contained exactly what I expected. A suicide note in Daniel's careful handwriting, explaining he couldn't live without Maria, asking forgiveness from anyone hurt by his decision. He'd left funeral instructions requesting burial in the plot beside Maria that he'd purchased months earlier. He'd also left a donation to our maintenance fund, along with a request that someone continue bringing coffee to Maria's grave every Sunday. The coroner confirmed what the prescription bottle suggested. Daniel died from sleeping pill overdose, probably in the early morning hours. No signs of foul play, no one else involved. Straightforward suicide by a grieving widower who chose to die where his wife was buried. But something about the scene bothered me. Something I couldn't articulate to Detective Walsh, nothing dramatic or suspicious. Just a feeling there was more to Daniel's story than the physical evidence showed. Maybe it was his peaceful expression, or how carefully he'd arranged Maria's things, or that he'd chosen to die on the bench where he'd spent so many Sunday afternoons talking to her. Whatever it was, it left me feeling like his story wasn't quite complete. Investigation concluded within 48 hours. Daniel's body was released to the funeral home he'd specified. Service was scheduled for Friday afternoon. I'd oversee burial arrangements according to his wishes. Funerals for suicide victims are always rough. But Daniel's was particularly heartbreaking because everyone in town knew him. Methodist Church was packed with co-workers, old school friends, people who'd known him as the quiet, kind man who'd loved his wife so completely he couldn't imagine life without her. Pastor Williams delivered a compassionate eulogy focusing on Daniel's life rather than his death, talking about his work dedication, devotion to Maria, quiet acts of kindness that touched so many people. There were tears, but also understanding. Collective recognition that Daniel's decision, while tragic, came from love rather than despair. As the funeral procession made its way to Greenwood Memorial, I found myself thinking about all those Sunday afternoons, watching Daniel sit on that bench, talking to Maria's headstone like she was right there beside him. His death felt like the natural conclusion to a love story interrupted by tragedy, but never truly ended. The burial service was brief and dignified, conducted graveside with Daniel's casket positioned exactly as he'd requested. As Pastor Williams spoke final words and the casket was lowered, I noticed someone had placed a single red rose on Maria's headstone. A gesture both beautiful and heartbreaking. It was as mourners began dispersing that I saw her. She stood about 30 feet away, partially hidden behind the Whitmore family monument. At first glance, just another mourner paying respects. Maybe a co-worker I hadn't met, but something made me look twice, and when I did, my breath caught. The woman wore a navy blue dress with small white flowers, the same dress Maria Thompson had worn in the wedding photo Daniel brought to her grave. Auburn hair cut shoulder length, elegant and practical, with gray strands at the temples catching afternoon light. Right height, right build, right age Maria would have been if she'd lived, but her face made my heart skip. Even from 30 feet away, partially shadowed by the monument, I could see this woman bore uncanny resemblance to Maria Thompson. From the dozens of photos Daniel had shown me. Same delicate features, same gentle expression, same way of holding herself that spoke of quiet confidence. I told myself it had to be a relative. Sister, cousin with family resemblance. Not uncommon for family to attend funerals, but watching her behavior struck me as odd. While other mourners gathered around Daniel's grave offering condolences, this woman stood apart, observing with an expression both deeply sad and strangely peaceful. As the crowd thinned and people headed to their cars, I decided to approach her, partly professional courtesy. I made it a point to speak with unfamiliar visitors, partly personal curiosity about her connection to Daniel and Maria, but as I walked toward the monument, she seemed to sense my approach. She turned and began walking away with purposeful stride, like she knew exactly where she was going. I quickened my pace, not wanting to lose sight of her among the maze of headstones. "Excuse me," I called out, voice carrying farther than intended in the quiet afternoon. "Miss, could I speak with you?" She stopped and turned around. For the first time, I got a clear, unobstructed view of her face. The resemblance to Maria wasn't just uncanny. It was impossible. This woman didn't just look like Maria. She looked exactly like Maria, down to the small scar above her left eyebrow that Daniel had mentioned from a childhood bicycle accident. "You're Mr. Mitchell, aren't you?" she said, voice soft but clear. With a hint of Southern accent, I remember Daniel saying Maria had from her Georgia childhood. "The cemetery director?" I nodded, suddenly finding it hard to speak. Up close, the resemblance was disorienting. This woman had Maria's eyes, the unusual shade of green Daniel described as sea glass color. Maria's smile, warm and genuine, but sad around the edges. Even Maria's way of tilting her head when she spoke, like she was really listening. "I wanted to thank you," she continued, voice taking on sincere gratitude, "for taking such good care of Daniel all these months. I know he appreciated having someone who understood what he was going through. The words hit me like a physical blow. How could she know about my observations of Daniel's Sunday visits? How could she know I'd been watching over him, worrying about him? And how could she be standing here talking when Maria Thompson had been dead 8 months? "I'm sorry," I managed, voice sounding strange to my own ears. "I don't think we've met. Are you a relative of Maria's? A sister?" She smiled then, and it was Maria's exact smile. The same expression from the wedding photo, the same gentle warmth that made Daniel fall in love. "Something like that," she said, confirming and denying my question simultaneously. "I just wanted you to know Daniel isn't suffering anymore. He's at peace now. And so am I." Before I could respond, before I could ask her name or how she'd known Daniel, she turned and began walking away. This time I followed more urgently, my composure finally giving way to overwhelming need to understand what was happening. "Wait!" I called out, breaking into a jog to keep up with her surprisingly quick pace. "Please, I need to ask you questions. How did you know Daniel? How did you know about his visits?" But she didn't stop, didn't even slow down. She continued through Section D with confident stride, navigating between headstones like someone who'd walked these paths hundreds of times. I followed her all the way to the main gate, heart pounding with exertion and confusion. But when I reached the entrance, she was nowhere to be seen. The parking lot was nearly empty, just my car, Tommy's pickup, and the hearse still being loaded with flowers. No sign of the woman in navy blue, no indication which direction she'd gone. I stood there several minutes, scanning the road both ways, looking for any trace, but it was like she'd vanished into thin air. The only evidence our conversation happened was lingering scent of jasmine, the same perfume Daniel said Maria used to wear. That evening I stayed late, ostensibly finishing paperwork, but really reviewing security camera footage from the afternoon. Greenwood Memorial had comprehensive surveillance, cameras at all entrances and throughout the grounds. If the woman had entered or left by normal means, cameras would have recorded it. After reviewing 4 hours of footage from 6 cameras, I found nothing. Cameras recorded the funeral service, mourners arriving and departing, Tommy and me doing usual duties, but no trace of the woman in navy blue. Like she'd never been there at all. I told myself there had to be logical explanation. Maybe she'd arrived with other mourners and left the same way, somehow avoiding camera angles. Maybe she was distant family from out of town who took back roads our cameras didn't cover. Maybe stress from Daniel's suicide and emotional weight of the funeral affected my perception, making me see resemblances that weren't there. But deep down where rational explanations go to die, I knew what I'd seen. I'd spoken with Maria Thompson, looked into her eyes, heard her voice, felt the warmth of her presence, and she'd thanked me for taking care of Daniel during those long, lonely months when he'd been slowly dying of grief. Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to that conversation, analyzing every word, every gesture, every detail I could remember. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that something extraordinary had happened that Friday afternoon. Something that defied rational explanation, but felt more real than anything I had experienced in years. 3 weeks after Daniel's funeral, I was doing my usual Sunday morning rounds when I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There on both Daniel and Maria's graves were fresh flower arrangements. Not elaborate funeral home bouquets, but simple bunches of seasonal blooms, white roses in baby's breath arranged with obvious care and love. I assumed they were from family or friends. But when I called Daniel's sister later that day, she seemed as puzzled as I was. "I thought you were having them delivered," she said. "Daniel always said how much he appreciated the way you took care of things there." But I wasn't having flowers delivered, and neither was anyone else I could identify. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Every Sunday morning, fresh flowers appeared on both graves. As regular as Daniel's visits had been, I started arriving earlier on Sundays, hoping to catch whoever was leaving them. But no matter how early I got there, 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock, even 4:31 determined morning. The flowers were always already in place, fresh and perfectly arranged, with dew still clinging to petals like they'd been placed moments before. Security cameras were equally unhelpful. Week after week, I reviewed Saturday evening through Sunday morning footage, but cameras never captured anyone approaching the graves. Flowers simply appeared between frames, like they'd materialized from nothing. After 3 months, I stopped trying to solve the mystery. Instead, I began thinking of the flowers as a gift. Not just to Daniel and Maria, but to everyone who visited that section. They'd become a symbol of enduring love, a reminder that some bonds are too strong to be broken by death. It's been 6 months since Daniel's funeral. The Sunday flowers continue appearing with clockwork regularity. The sense of peace around Daniel and Maria's graves has become one of Greenwood Memorial's most remarked features. People drive from neighboring towns to visit what some call the love graves. But for me, the most significant change has been in my own understanding of this work. For 12 years, I thought of myself as simply a caretaker of the dead. But my encounter with the woman who may or may not have been Maria Thompson has given me different perspective on what it means to manage a cemetery. I now understand that places like this aren't just repositories for the deceased. They're bridges between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. They're spaces where love continues existing even after the people who created that love are gone. Every Sunday morning when I see those fresh flowers on Daniel and Maria's graves, I'm reminded of the conversation I had with a woman who couldn't possibly have been there, but somehow was. I think about her words, that Daniel was at peace, that she was at peace, that love had found a way to transcend the boundaries separating life from death. Whether what I experienced that Friday was real or imagined, supernatural or psychological, doesn't matter as much as I once thought. What matters is that it changed how I see my work, my community, and the enduring power of human connection. Sometimes late at night when I'm doing final security checks, I catch a whiff of jasmine near Section D. And I smile, knowing that somewhere, somehow, Daniel Thompson is still having his Sunday conversations with the woman he loved enough to follow into whatever comes after this life. And every Sunday, without fail, fresh flowers appear on both graves. A weekly reminder that some love stories are too powerful to be contained by the boundaries of a single lifetime. I still don't know who leaves those flowers. I still can't explain the woman I spoke with at Daniel's funeral. I still can't account for the sense of peace that transformed Section D from a place of mourning into a place of hope. But I've learned that some questions don't need answers, and some mysteries are more meaningful when they remain mysterious. In the end, maybe that's what Daniel and Maria's story is really about. Not the tragedy of love interrupted by death, but the triumph of love that refuses to be interrupted by anything at all. And if that's not worth believing in, I don't know what is.